So as we look at the Torah for Rosh Hashanah, first and second day, primarily first day, but as we look for the reading of Torah for Rosh Hashanah, first and second day, the series that the rabbis chose, what I want you to keep in mind, the questions that we'll be actually wrestling with as part of the analysis of all of it is, why did the rabbis choose this particular cycle of readings to begin our New Year Torah reading? They could have read from wherever we were in the actual cycle of Torah readings for the year that was also set up rabbinically. And then we would have been at the end of Deuteronomy. And indeed on Simchat Torah, we read the end of Deuteronomy and the beginning of Genesis to remind ourselves that Torah goes on. And since this is the beginning of the new year, we could have done something like that instead of Simchat Torah or in addition to Simchat Torah. But I wanted to point out that in actual fact, the Torah says nothing about this particular portion being connected to the new year. The only connection is at the end of the story of the second day, we have a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. And that's a bit of I think, possibly a tenuous connection to Rosh Hashanah, simply because we have a ram in a thicket by its horn and we have a shofar. But otherwise, there doesn't seem to be anything in this particular cycle that lends itself to a new year. It's not, the tradition was not that Yitzchak was born on Tishri 1. There's not a tradition that Yitzchak had his binding by Avraham on Tishri 1. So there's no real connection to the new year. So why choose this? And in fact, the Reform asked that question and said, that really doesn't make sense. We should be choosing a beginning story. And so Reform actually replaced this in many cases with the opening readings of the book of Genesis with creation, which the tradition does say happened on Tishri 1. So the question, why this particular cycle? And that leads to the next question, which is, what did the rabbis want us to do with this? Because for many people, this whole cycle, today's reading and tomorrow's reading, is a bit problematic. And why read it? And what are we supposed to do with the reading? So before we do that, I just wanted to point out where the Torah actually does talk about Rosh Hashanah. So here we are in Leviticus. We are in Leviticus chapter 23, which begins with the cycle of the holidays, starting with Shabbat. It says these are the appointed seasons, these are the holy times, begins with Shabbat, and then starts with the first month, which is the spring month, the month of Passover. And then we have 7 weeks from the first month, and we have Shavuot. And then we move on and we have 7 months. And finally, we get a reading that says, Vadaber Adonai el Moshe lemor, which God is constantly saying, God said to Moses and say the following, Daber el b'nei Yisrael, speak to all of the people of Israel, lemor, as follows, and says, B'chodesh hashvi'i be'achad lachodesh yeh lachem Shabbaton, zichron truah mikra kodesh. The 7th month, the first day of the 7th month, will be a Sabbath type day, a Shabbaton, zichron truah, a remembrance of the calling of the shofar, the sounding of the shofar, a holy convocation, a time of coming together for holiness. And like every Shabbat, kol melechet avodah lo ta'asu, all forms of work you will not do. V'hikravtem ishe ladonai, and you will come near with an offering to God. So there's a statement in the Torah in Leviticus where we are told to do Rosh Hashanah. We're not told to do very much. We're supposed to not work, and we're supposed to remember horn blowing, the sounding of the horns, the truah. Doesn't even say we're supposed to do the sounding of the horns. It just says we're supposed to remember the sounding of the horns. And the question, of course, would be here, what horns are we supposed to remember? Because the first time we in our history that we really hear of the blowing of the horns, we're marching around Jericho. So this would have been, this certainly seems to be, this particular cycle of readings would have made sense for Rosh Hashanah, since we're told Rosh Hashanah. Next, and the only other place where Rosh Hashanah is actually mentioned in the Torah is in the book of Numbers, chapter 29, where it says, B'chodesh hashvi'i be'achad b'chodesh, again, in the seventh day, on the first day of the month, Mikra Kodesh, again, a holy gathering, Kol Melechet Avodah Lo Ta'asu, and it's a Yom Teruah, a day of horn blowing, a day of the sounding of horns. That, however, is in fact read on Rosh Hashanah, both first and second day. This is the maftir, the second Torah that we read. So we do read this on Rosh Hashanah. So our initial question would be, all right, so the Numbers passage made sense. The rabbis chose it, but they stuck it at the end. The Leviticus passage makes sense. The rabbis rejected it completely. So what did the rabbis choose? Here we go. They chose Genesis chapter 21 for the first day and Genesis chapter 22 for the second day. The Genesis chapter 22 one is probably the best known for its Rosh Hashanah connection because it's the binding of Isaac. What I want to do is take you through, obviously, Genesis chapter 21 because we're in first day, so this is the first day. And again, our overriding question that we're thinking about as we do this is, why this? What are we supposed to do with this? And there is actually a common thread, I think, between Genesis chapter 21, the first day, and Genesis chapter 22, the second day. Chapter 21 is broken up into three stories. The first story, the shortest one, is Yitzchak is born. And Sarah is 90, and Avraham is 100. It's a beginning. It's a new beginning for Avraham. All right, it makes sense. We're beginning the year. We're beginning, finally, the seed of Avraham that will become the promise that God had made to Avraham. But the second story is Yitzchak is about 3 years old, and there's a weaning party. This is, by the way, the first party we hear about for a baby. It's not a circumcision party, it's a weaning party, which is really more, I think, Sarah's party than Avraham or Yitzchak's. Especially if Sarah, at the age of 90, has been nursing for 3 years. And suddenly, verse 9, Vatera Sarah et ben Hagar. So Sarah looks out and sees that son of Hagar, which is interesting because it doesn't say the son of her maidservant that she gave to Avraham and said, here, get her pregnant so I can claim the boy for myself, which was the previous story. but she refers to her as Ben Hagar HaMitzrit. And we can almost hear, I think, tones of when you refer to somebody in a nasty way, you would say that son of a something. And Hagar literally means the stranger. So that stranger, that Egyptian stranger. And we know that the relationship between Israel and Egypt was somewhat filled with tension, as we will learn about in Genesis, but in Exodus rather. But that son of a Egyptian stranger, Asher Yalda Avraham, and she sees that boy, who is, we know at this point, about 13 years old, because he was born or maybe even 16 years old. He's born some 13 years before Yitzchak. And if Yitzchak is 3, then Ishmael is about 16. And she sees that boy, Mitzachek. Mitzachek is a strange word that I've studied in other ways with people. It's something that when Avraham does it with his Sarah, who is apparently his sister, it becomes very suspicious. And when Yitzchak does it with his wife, who is supposedly his sister, it's very suspicious. So there's some sexual connotations to the word mitzachek, which is a combination of the word misachek, to play, and sachok, to laugh, or possibly even to taunt. But it says she sees the boy doing whatever it is, and that doesn't even say he was doing it with or to or around Yitzchak, the little 3-year-old. Just sees him doing it. And apparently that's enough for her to say, Vatomer el Avraham, she says, kick out that my maidservant and her son, get rid of them. So the second half, or the second part of the story, which is the longer story, is Avraham is told to expel his older son. Not very good family relations. Avraham is somewhat taken aback by this, does not really want to treat his son that way, but God tells Avraham, whatever Sarah tells you, that's what you're supposed to do. And so he kicks him out. Verse 14, I think, is a crucial verse. It says, Vayashkem Avraham baboker. And we're going to hear exactly that same sentence, that same phrase in the second day's portion on the binding of Isaac story. The rabbis tell us when it says Vayashkem baboker, literally he got up early in the morning. That whenever it says somebody got up early in the morning, it was because they were hastening to do a mitzvah. So it would seem that this kicking Ishmael out at the words of Sarah, Avraham views as a mitzvah, views as something that really needs to be done right away. You can't procrastinate, postpone, tarry, has to do it. And the rest of this second part of the story then is considerably longer than the first part of the story, which was Yitzchak is born and he gets weaned. That's pretty much Yitzchak's story at this point. Ishmael's story, however, is his father sends his mother and him out into the desert with a little container of water and some bread, and they have no place to go. Apparently, they're estranged from their Egyptian family that they haven't seen for many years. They can't go back there. They wander around in the wilderness around Beersheba, and the water runs out in the container. And Hagar sends the boy under one bush, and she goes under a bush quite a ways away, because we're told it's as far away as you can shoot an arrow. And she says, I'm going to hide over here because I don't want to watch my son die. We're both going to die, but I don't want to see it happen. and apparently she cries out, and God listens to her. So far, Sarah has said something, and God told Abraham, listen to Sarah. Now Hagar cries out, and God listens directly to Hagar, and God reassures Hagar, says, don't worry, your son's not going to die, he's going to become a great nation. And she opened her eyes, and there was a big jug of water, a well of water filled to the top. And they drink, and they go, and they settle in the wilderness of Paran, and Ishmael gets a wife that his mother picks for him, an Egyptian wife, which is all nice. And then the third part of the story is an encounter with Avimelech over wells. And we last saw Avimelech when Abraham was telling Avimelech that Sarah, his wife, was his sister. And we had some problems there. Abraham and Avimelech had some problems, but they ended that story reconciling. And now here we are again with Abraham and Avimelech going off to argue. Apparently Avimelech's servants are spoiling all of the wells that Abraham dug. There's a lot of fight between the people of Avimelech and the people of Abraham fighting over wells, and they end up making a covenant, and Abraham settles in Plishtim, in the land of Avimelech. And all of that has nothing to do with Rosh Hashanah. The other thing I want to point out is after Sarah tells Abraham, send that son of a Hagar, Mitzrit, son of an Egyptian foreigner, away, Abraham packs up a box lunch for them and a little bottle of water, and sends them off into the desert without any directions, without any place to go. And Sarah's voice disappears. We hear Hagar and Ishmael through a good third of the story. And then we hear Avraham and Avimelech through the last third of the story with no Sarah. And tomorrow we're going to be reading, God comes to Avraham and says, take your son. And Avraham takes his son, and they head off, and they go and do this binding story. And there's no Sarah in the entire story tomorrow. So here we have two stories with almost no Sarah. And we have one story where Avraham loses one son because he sends him away, which I would say probably for a 16-year-old boy and his mother is somewhat traumatic. We hear of fathers abandoning today their teenage sons and their mothers. And we hear a lot of psychological discussion of it's a bit of a trauma. And then tomorrow we have Avraham standing over his son, bound up on an altar, with Avraham standing over him with a knife, which I would imagine would be a bit traumatic as well. Tomorrow's story, by the way, if we read from the chronology of today, that is, Yitzchak was 3 years old in today's story. And then there is the sending of Ishmael away. And then there is the Avraham and Avimelech encounters over the wells. So it would seem to be a matter of just a few years at most that it was covered in this part of the story. Then tomorrow's story begins with the words, Vayhi acharei hadvarim ha'ela, and it was after these things. So it would seem, and to the basis of today's chronology, that Yitzchak, when he's being bound up by his father, is probably 6, 7, maybe 10 years old at the most, which makes more sense than him being older if his father is going to pick him up and tie him up and put him on an altar of wood. If we go by the chronology following tomorrow's story, the next thing we know, Sarah dies at 127. Yitzchak was born when she was 90. So on that chronology, Yitzchak at the time of the binding is 37. So if we read the chronology of today's stories, Yitzchak's maybe 7 to 10 years old. If we read the chronology after today's story, Yitzchak is 37. Just wanted to point that out, but I think the crucial part of today's cycle is today we read Avraham becomes estranged from his son Ishmael and her mother and his mother. Tomorrow, when we have the reading of the cycle, it's going to end with Avraham returned to the servants down below at the bottom of the mountain, and Yitzchak disappears from the story. So in today's story, Sarah disappears after a conflict over a child. And tomorrow, and the child also disappears from the story with Avraham. And tomorrow, Sarah is already gone from the story, and Avraham becomes estranged from his other son after apparently threatening to give him over to God with a knife. So the rabbis chose family, what I would call extreme dysfunctionality, as our reading for the entrance into the new year. Now, keeping in mind our two questions, why did the rabbis choose this cycle? And the corollary question, what are we supposed to do with it? You are welcome to unmute yourselves and weigh in on either possible answers or even more problems. How you feel about this is what we should enter the year with.
It's weird. I have no clue why. There's got to be something in Talmud somewhere that says why. And I'm sure you know the answer to that one. I don't, but it's a weird story to begin the new year, except that every family in some way is messed up.
Other thoughts?
I also agree. It's very weird. It does make the Akedah something that is known to many, many, many people. And
is that a good thing or a bad thing?
right. Yeah. It is a thing that, both the dismissal of Hagar and Ishmael and the binding are both painful stories.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
By the way, the next thing we hear about Sarah is she's dead, and the Torah specifically says Avraham came to bury her.
So they were separate.
So if you read the actual text, it seems like Avraham had to come from wherever he was to where Sarah was to bury her. So the full text would seem to indicate that Sarah disappears because Sarah disappears from the Avraham story.
The other note that I have read is that where it says Abraham and his servant come down from the mountain, Isaac does not, and that's why Sarah dies.
Right, that's a commentary. So it says Avraham came to bury Sarah. What the rabbis do with that coming to Sarah is he's coming back from the mountain where she has seen him go off with their son, and she sees that it's Avraham and the two servants, and she dies of heart failure, seeing that Yitzhak, her greatest fears, have been played out. But that's a wonderful midrashic reading of the text. It's not actually the plain reading of the text, especially if you follow the pre-chronology of the binding of Isaac and have Yitzhak being around 7 to 10 years old. That means that Sarah's going to be living another 30 years before she dies, and Avraham then comes to bury her. So that would put Avraham and Sarah not living together. Avraham comes down with the two servants, and we don't end tomorrow's story with where did he go as far as coming back to be with Sarah. So yes, that's the midrash that puts that connects the death of Sarah to the binding of Isaac, and thus makes Yitzchak 37. But again, if we look at this pre-chronology and it says after these things were the kicking out of Yishmael, the travails of Yishmael and Hagar, God's relationship to Yishmael and Hagar, and then the travails between Avraham and Avimelech over wells, and finally creating a treaty, which again, didn't take, I don't think, 30 years to do. So in the pre-chronology, Sarah and Avraham are not together for some significant period of time, and it's not related to the binding. By the way, the next thing we hear about of Yishmael and Yitzchak together is they're burying Avraham when he dies.
That's nice to get together for that.
Yeah, so Yishmael is kicked out and settles down in the area of Beersheba. Avraham comes down from the mountain, and Yitzchak goes someplace, and we have to wait for a while to hear Yitzchak's stories. We do hear later that Avraham sent his servants off to go find a wife for Yitzchak, but we don't have Avraham and Yitzchak living together when the servant goes off to find the wife. And when the servant comes back, Yitzchak is out in the field. It doesn't say Yitzchak and Avraham. So we don't hear Yitzchak and Avraham together again until Yitzchak and Yishmael come back to bury Avraham. So Avraham now has faced significant family trauma twice in a very short period of time, losing one son to which he blames on his wife. And it's very clear, I would say from the text, that he blames Sarah for the whole thing because he doesn't want to do it. And God says, let Sarah's voice prevail.
Sam,
Yes.
quick question. How does it come to be that this is the part that's read on Rosh Hashanah?
Right. So that was my opening question before we started, as we started, which was, why did the rabbis, and you missed that little entry.
Oh, I'm
That's
sorry. Okay.
No problem. It's that's our question. So what I pointed out was in Leviticus, we have 3 verses that specifically tell us it's the first day of the 7th month, a remembrance of the sounding of the horns, and the rabbis don't include that at all in the readings on Rosh Hashanah. And that would have made more sense. In Numbers, we have the second reference to Rosh Hashanah, and it's a sacrifice day, it's an offering day, and the blowing of the horns, and the rabbis did include that as the maftir.
Mhm.
So the rabbis picked this passage, and that was my question. There's no place here where it says on the 1st of Tishri, Yitzchak was born. There was no place where it says on the first day of the 7th month, God decided to test Avraham. There's no indication in the chronology. We have a year sense of chronology here in the series of stories, but we don't have a month sense of the when in the year did this happen. So yeah, the question is, why did the rabbis choose this? And what I pointed out was the Reform movement actually said, you know, we should be reading the first chapter of Genesis because the tradition does say that Rosh Hashanah is the anniversary of the creation of the world. So on the anniversary of the creation of the world, let's reread the creation of the world.
The reform, I'm sorry.
Yeah, the reform movement put that as the Torah reading for Rosh
First
Hashanah.
day. But for the second day, they do have the.
Well, the reform originally didn't have a second day.
Right. But I think several reform.
Yeah, now
think
reform
that's
can do a
now.
lot of things. Yeah,
Right.
the original form was a little bit as authoritarian as the Orthodox that it rejected, just in the opposite direction. So yeah, reform cut out the second day. And then what did they do with the 2 days of readings, the birth of Isaac and the near sacrifice of Isaac? They said, let's read about creation, which actually made more sense in that way. Now a lot of reform will do 2 days, but they'll do the binding of Isaac on the first day, and they'll do the second day as more of a meditation service or an experiential service or something like that. So, but reform now really does what the minhag of the congregation and the rabbi is. And so there are still reform that read the Genesis.
Definitely.
But meanwhile, Leviticus talks about it and nobody chose it. So that was the question. Why did the rabbis choose this? And yes, Amy, that's my question.
Okay, I'm sorry, but you know, it's all
No.
definitely in preparation for Yom Kippur, this story.
And on Yom Kippur, we actually read Torah portions about Yom Kippur.
Mhm.
On Rosh Hashanah, we barely read a portion about one of the 2 portions about Rosh Hashanah. So we can't really know why the rabbis chose this, since we don't get we get a lot of commentary and discussion in the Talmud about, but by the time the Talmud is doing it, it's already actually what's being done. So the earliest rabbis who did it, we don't really have any footnotes, appendices of, we're doing this for this reason. It's just, this is the way it is. And in some sense, the rabbis are not often innovating, but rather codifying. So somewhere along the line, some aspect of Judaism chose these as the passages for the readings on Rosh Hashanah.
And do you have a hypothesis about why, or what does it mean to you?
Right. So I'm not sure why, but except that I think that however this started, there was clearly something that they had in mind that they wanted us to do with it. There was some message that they wanted us to do with it. And that's then whatever their intention was, even if we knew it, we wouldn't necessarily buy into it. And so to a certain extent, what do we do with this? We learn from what they may have wanted us to do with it. We learn from subsequent generations who did something else with it. And we look at our life and we say, now what do we do with this? And of course, that's why you don't hear the same sermon every year on Rosh Hashanah. Rabbis have to come up with a new sermon every Rosh Hashanah because it's a new year. And we reflect on the previous year, we anticipate the coming year, we try to prepare ourselves. We may build on prior sermons, but most rabbis don't rerun sermons on their high holy days. They spend a month of Elul writing their new ones that build from. I had the advantage of, because I worked in interim congregation work, that is, I worked with congregations in transition for some 10 years. I was with a new congregation every year, so I could rerun sermons and they didn't know it. But I had a new take every year. And it's interesting that you say, I think that everybody knows the binding of Isaac story, the Akedah story, and day 2 popularized that. However, day 1 was the birth of Isaac story, was the expulsion of Ishmael and his mother story, and was the Avraham and Avimelech well story, and not many people know that. I mean, it's almost as if they sleep through the first day Torah and they pay attention to the second day. And the second day Torah certainly is highly problematic, the relationship between Avraham and Yitzchak and the near sacrifice. Some of the commentary does say that these are not positive stories, but negative stories.
Mm-hmm.
Torah very often is filled with not what we're supposed to do, but what we're not supposed to do by learning from the problems they had when they did them. And the Torah is filled with that. The Torah is going to tell us, do not marry 2 women who are sisters in their own lifetime. Because we learned in Genesis, that can cause problems. We're going to say, do not sacrifice your children, because we learned in Genesis, even the attempt or the near or the symbolic sacrifice of children causes problems. We learn about various other aspects of do not sleep with your father's wife, because we're going to learn in Genesis that caused a lot of problems. Read the story of Reuben if you don't believe me on that one.
Yeah.
And so this would be then, in another sense, look what happens when husband and wife are not on the same page about their children. And there is some kind of very traumatic loss of a child, and the damage that it can come from can cause in a husband and wife. And this is the first day story. So the loss of Ishmael is certainly something that is Avraham has no choice over. And very often, probably all the time, the loss of a child is not something that either parent really had a choice about, but the loss of a child can cause the dissolution of a relationship between a husband and wife, especially when there's blaming going on between the husband and wife over the loss or the significant trauma of a child. And so Avraham and Sarah disappears, and we can learn that possibly, and I have no idea whether this is what the rabbis intended, I think probably not. I have no idea whether this is helpful to anybody else, but one possible answer is when Avraham and Sarah are not on the same page, Avraham blames Sarah for the loss of his oldest son, their relationship ends.
You wonder
So
why Abraham wouldn't push back like he did with Sodom and Gomorrah.
Well, Avraham doesn't push back like he did with Sodom and Gomorrah on the binding of Isaac.
No.
Avraham doesn't push back against God on the listen to Sarah and do what she says. And in fact, God doesn't say even, don't blame her. God, in a sense, says, blame her.
Mm-hmm.
Which is not a great thing, I think, for God to say.
No.
But we can take issue with God throughout the Torah too, if we want. And that's very Jewish.
And we do.
Yes.
Definitely.
I mean, the rabbis in some places say that it's better to argue with God than ignore God. So you can be angry, which again becomes human relations. If you're angry with someone, it's better to argue with them and work it out than to turn your back on them and reject them.
It's like Matthew Broderick arguing with God throughout Lady Hawk, if you've ever seen that movie.
Yes.
It's hysterical.
Well, or Tevye.
Mm-hmm.
Tevye has words with God all the time.
Yep.
So we have issues of Why on Rosh Hashanah? I have no idea. What do we do with it? And in a sense, sort of in retrospect, say, oh, yes, this could make sense on Rosh Hashanah. Most of us have probably had some problems in the past year. Had some issues perhaps of blaming, have had some issues of separation, have had some issues that were traumatic. And we learn from the Torah, you can dwell in it or you can move beyond it. And so one might make a Rosh Hashanah sermon on today's Torah portion around reconciliation versus blaming and anger and other issues. And could Abraham and Sarah have repaired the relationship? Well, they can't go back and undo what Sarah did and what Abraham did and how Abraham felt about what Sarah did. But rather than lose Sarah, there could have been a story of reconciliation or an attempt to actually recognize with Sarah that while the loss was not in Abraham's hands, the potential that was realized for Ishmael would not have happened without that trauma in his life. And one of the theories of grief that I've written about and practiced is out of loss can come growth. And in fact, every growth is precipitated by some loss. And so the question about loss is not, can we undo it or should we undo it or do we try to undo the loss when the loss is actually a fait accompli, but through the grief over the loss, can we become stuck in the grief and not grow, or can we work through the grief and learn to grow and find some new direction? And that's the new year. The new year is the time of trying to learn from our past to grow better into the future. So here we have one of the most traumatic events in our Torah past as a challenge to learn from it so that we can grow better into the future. Is that why the rabbis chose it? I don't know. I can't ask them that. And to what extent did the rabbis choose it? And to what extent did the rabbis inherit it and codify it out of some proto-rabbinic period? So how far back does this all go? And we can't know for sure. We can only know when they told us they were doing it and they added on to what they were doing and codified what we were doing. But there's a lot of Torah, which is derived from earlier oral traditions. And since they were never actually recorded and the floppy disks that they recorded them on are no longer readable, and we don't have the equipment to read their earliest texts. Here too, we don't know where this started. All of it is built on some earlier innovations, development, response to whatever was happening at that time. So a lot of our Mishnah, Talmud, oral Torah, and even some of our Torah, like the book of Deuteronomy, comes from past issues. The destruction of the first temple leads to the Babylonian exile, and the Babylonian exile actually leads to what will become Rabbinic Judaism. But we don't get it in full force until we're in the end of Second Temple period time. So what's going on in the development of practice in different communities? We don't know. what readings were being done by different places at different times. We do know, for example, that the cycle of readings that we do on an annual basis, ending and beginning with Simchat Torah, was not the only reading of Torah cycle that was practiced. We do know that there was a triennial period in some early proto-rabbinic and synagogue type communities that read the Torah over the course of 3 years and did not have an annual Simchat Torah. And in fact, the Simchat Torah, if we look back at that Leviticus passage, which we don't read on Rosh Hashanah, even though it's the only other passage that talks about Rosh Hashanah, it begins with Shabbat, moves from Pesach, and ends with Sukkot and Shmini Atzeret, and there is no Simchat Torah in the Torah. So Simchat Torah only happens once there's an annual cycle. And so therefore, yes, how was it that this became codified? Well, it became codified out of some traditions that were developing in some places possibly, and it developed in some places possibly for some reason that maybe I'm right. Maybe they were highly psychologically astute 2,500 years ago, and they wanted us to see the new year as a time to remember and work through the issues of the old year and not relive and continue to live in and become frozen in the issues of the old year. And so thus we begin the new year by reading two of the most traumatic events in our earliest history, because they are the loss of Avraham, of both of his sons, and Avraham becomes a lonely old man because he loses two sons, he loses a wife for a significant period of time, and he goes and marries again and has more children. And there are rabbis, by the way, that second wife, Keturah, was actually Hagar, who Avraham went back to when he didn't have Sarah anymore. We don't know of the relationship between Avraham and Hagar. We know the relationship between Hagar and Sarah.
It wasn't good.
And possibly we learned from that having two live-in mothers with you at the same time is probably not the best idea. That is, two live-in women who are the mothers to your children. So in modern language, when you and your wife are mutually infertile and you use a surrogate mother, it's not a good idea to have her move in with you.
Just watch Sister Wives and you get the whole shebang.
So yeah, Avraham uses a surrogate mother and she lives with them. And that's then lots of problems between the two women who are mothers to two of his children. So yeah, if you have an ex-wife with one group of children, you can hopefully have a relationship with your children, a little bit of High Holy Day sermon, but it's not a good idea while you're married to your second wife to have your ex-wife move in with you.
No.
So some possible thoughts for Rosh Hashanah, first day, with the stories not as well known as the binding of Isaac, but I would say equally traumatic. And again, the rabbis chose chapter 21 as first day, chapter 22 as second day. And if it was only the Akedah, the binding of Isaac story, the rabbis could have done chapter 22 both days. They do the maftir, the same numbers portion, both days. When neither day of Rosh Hashanah is on Shabbat, they do the same shofar service both days. Basically, the liturgy is the same both days. The Torah could have been the same both days. Or the rabbis could have had part 1 of the Akedah day 1 and part 2 of the Akedah day 2, saying, leaving you on day 1 with a cliffhanger, saying, if you want to know what happened, you have to come back tomorrow. Amy, yeah.
No, I was just laughing.
So there seemed to be a reason that we start with the birth of Isaac, which, okay, if you're going to have the binding, you have to have the birth. But the Torah gives us 2 big stories in between the birth of Isaac and the binding of Isaac. And they're not happy stories for Avraham.
Mm-mm.
He apparently becomes disengaged from his wife, clearly becomes disengaged from his son, and then has to reconcile. And the only reconciliation actually in the Torah for Rosh Hashanah is between Avraham and Avimelech.
Mm.
Avraham has problems with his neighbor Avimelech, and they reconcile. Avraham has problems with Sarah, no reconciliation. Problems with Ishmael, no reconciliation. Problems with Yitzchak, no reconciliation.
Well, I think if you tied me to an altar, there wouldn't be reconciliation for me either.
Well, we bind a lot of our family members with tubes. End of life issues in hospitals.
Yes, true. That is true.
And is it always the choice of the person being bound?
Nope. Not
But
at all.
I'm sorry, I just thought of something else, which is that Isaac comes down from the mountain and not only has his father bound him because God told him, but also from the, he lost his mother because of this. I mean, perhaps he never sees, one way of reading it is he never sees his mother again.
Right, again, he goes, we don't have him going back to Sarah.
No. So
Sarah dies
Yep.
two
in the next story, yeah.
major, the most major losses. Your father's going to kill you and your mother dies.
Well, or your father's going to kill you and you can't go, and for some reason you can't go back or don't go back to your mother, and you're a kid. He's not 37. He's 10, 12,
Right.
13. He's
Yeah.
a kid
Yeah.
off on his own. And his brother was a kid, just 16 years old, when he was sent out to live with his mother on their own with no community and no support.
Right.
So yeah, self-sufficient children. What do we do?
Traumatized children.
How do we make them and what do we do with them and what happens to them? Well, I hate to say it, but that's where we end our discussion of Torah
It's very
for
fun.
this Rosh Hashanah.
Thank
And
you very
so-
much.
Thank you, Sam and Shana.